Hi, welcome back to Risk Management. Today is Risk Screening Part 3. We've been dealing with issues of whether test accuracy and improving that test accuracy will actually improve our ability to diagnose and treat conditions such as diseases, terrorism, or any other sort of risk that we're monitoring for. What we've concluded in past lectures is that knowledge of a harm's prevalence, how likely that condition is critical for a decision whether to recommend monitoring. So here in this example, we have the harm prevalence, and we see going from left to right on this triangle, an increasing harm prevalence. The question is, do we recommend monitoring? And if the harm is common, that is, the likelihood that this condition exists is high, then there is a better chance to recommend monitoring. Conversely, if the harm is rare in the population and the risk is low, then the question of whether to recommend monitoring is more often than not answered in the negative. What we're going to see today is some examples of why we do this. Why is it that we're so circumspect and so unwilling to screen when prevalence is low? And what we're going to look at today by the end of today's lecture is what's called decision tree analysis, a form of modeling that helps us to estimate the likelihood of certain results given the prevalence and the accuracy of the test that we're using to treat a specific condition or harm or risk. So let's get started. I want to do just as another practice example, and I know we did this in the last class, but I'm going to use different data, but a similar sort of scenarios just so we get in the practice of understanding how we determine the positive predictive value. Remember, this is asking the question of, given a positive test result, how likely is it that someone actually has the condition that's being screened for? So imagine we have the following scenario. We're screening a population of 10,000 individuals, and there's a prevalence of 10% in the population of these individuals for whatever risk it is we're screening for. In other words, 1,000 of the 10,000 people has the condition. We just don't know which ones. That's why we're screening. Let's also talk about the accuracy of the test we're using. Let's say that the sensitivity of the test is 80% and the specificity 90%. So this is a pretty accurate test. What's the positive predictive value of this test given that prevalence? Well, to do this, we again construct the 2x2 matrix that we did in the last lecture, asking, is the harm present, yes or no? And is the test result positive or negative? In looking at this, let's start with the top upper left quadrant. We're asking, what's the number of cases in which, given the fact that the person actually has the disease, they will also test positive? Here we take the sensitivity, 80%, and we multiply it by the number of cases, 1,000. That's the number of people who have the actual condition, the prevalence. And so we get 800. 800 people are going to test positive when in fact they should test positive. That's the true positive rate for this test. What's the false negative rate in this case? Well, here we take the number of cases, 1,000, and we subtract 800 from it, the number of true positives. And what we're left with is the number of false negatives. 200 out of the 1,000 people who are tested who actually have the harm or the condition, the disease, the terrorist tendency, whatever it is we're screening for, 200 of them will test falsely negative even though they have the condition. Let's now turn to the other side of the table here, where we're asking for people who don't have the harm, where they're negative for the condition. So let's say of those people, how many are going to truly test negative when in fact they don't have the disease, the harm, the risk factor? Here we multiply the specificity instead of the sensitivity, specificity being 90%, times a healthy population of 9,000, right? So we know 1,000 have the condition, 9,000 do not. So that's the negative of the condition times the specificity gives us 8,100 true negative results. And of course, to get the false positive rate, we simply subtract from 9,000, the number of healthy people, the true negative rate, 8,100, and we're left with 900 false positives. Okay. Now, to get the positive predictive value here, we take the number of total true positives, 800, and we divide by the total number of positive tests, 800 plus 900 here, or 1700. The positive predictive value for this scenario is 47%, which means about half the time the test comes up positive, the person truly has the condition. That's not a horrible PPV, but it's also not perfect. It's a coin flip's chance that the test is going to accurately diagnose the condition. What about if we change the prevalence? Instead of 10%, we make it only 1%. So we drop the prevalence by a tenfold factor. In other words, only 100 cases of the disease or illness or condition out of 10,000 rather than 1,000 out of 10,000. Let's keep the test accuracy the same, 80% sensitivity, 90% specificity. We would predict, if you remember back to the last lecture where we said that tests are very sensitive to the prevalence in the population, a huge decrease in the PPV as a result. Let's see what happens. To test in the upper left quadrant for harms that are present where we're going to get true positives, we multiply the sensitivity times the number of cases. In other words, 80. That's the number of true positives. How about negative test results? Well, here we're going to take the number of true positives and subtract it from the total number of people with the condition, 100, and we get 20. That's the number of false negatives that we're going to result from this. Let's do the following for the opposite side of the chart, where the harm is not present. The number of negative tests is going to be the specificity, 90%, times the healthy population, 9,900. Remember, there's 100 who have the condition out of 10,000. That means 9,900 do not. That gives us a specificity of a number of people of 8,991 true negatives. And we can subtract from 9,900 that number of true negatives and get the number of false positives, 809. So that's what we're left with here. To get the PPV, we take the number of true positives, 80, and we divide by the total number of true positives plus false positives. In other words, all positive results, 889. And what we see here is we get a positive predictive value of 9.2%, substantially lower than the 47% when the prevalence was 10% rather than 1%. Notice how sensitive the test is to the prevalence of the condition in the population, even with an accurate test. In fact, this scenario is very common, that people mistake the ability and the accuracy of testing to give us confidence in being able to screen for conditions. Take the Illinois AIDS testing scenario from 1988 to 1989. Governor Thompson signed a bill allowing for mandatory AIDS testing for all premarital couples proposing to get married. And only 21 months after that bill was passed, it was repealed. Why? Because out of more than 275,000 marital applicants who were screened for HIV, only 56 positive cases were identified of HIV. This out of 275,000. It wasn't the accuracy of the test that was bad. It's just that AIDS and HIV are a very low prevalence condition, and so there were a lot of false positives and very few true positives actually resulting. The same legislation also repealed a premarital syphilis testing requirement, again, because the prevalence of syphilis is so low in the population. This is an example of legislators making a mistake where they mandated screening only afterwards determining that the prevalence was so low that the screening was not worthwhile. So here's the other thing that I don't want us to fall in the mistake of making, is saying, well, if we have a high PPV, then we should screen. That's not necessarily the case either. You should always ask yourself the following. If I monitor, if I screen before the condition is otherwise obvious, can I treat the condition better than I could if I just waited until the condition manifested itself obviously without any special monitoring? That is, will the monitoring do anything special or help us in any way other than letting things take their natural course? If the answer is no, there's no reason to screen, because after all screening creates false positives and false negatives, and there are costs and consequences to that. So even where a test is very accurate, and even where there's a high prevalence such that the PPV is also high, it doesn't automatically mean we should screen. We need to use judgment and think about why we're doing what we're doing. There are two approaches to determining the appropriateness and necessity of any proposed screening program. The first of these is a compared controlled clinical trial. You'll remember back we talked about RCTs very long ago in this course, and doing randomized trials where we monitor one group and we don't monitor another, and then we compare when we randomize across populations. That's a very good gold standard way of doing things, but often it's not available to us as a testing standard. So what people will often do when they lack the capacity to get an RCT study done is to do what's called decision tree analysis. This is a modeling technique that can simulate the rigor of a controlled clinical trial without actually having to engage in that lengthy and expensive process. Let's see an example of how this works. Let's pretend we're screening for liver cancer monitoring, and we're going to screen for a population of 100,000 individuals who are all going to have their blood tested. And here's how this protocol is going to go. If you screen and you test positive for the liver cancer on a blood test, then the blood test will be administered a second time just to make sure that we're being cautious about getting the right result. And if you test positive twice, then a liver biopsy where a needle is injected into your liver and a sample drawn from it, a process that itself carries risks of death, will in fact be done as a third step in the intervention. If that liver test also turns up positive, then significant intervention will be made, including treatment of cancer in very aggressive ways, assuming that 3 positive test results, 2 positive blood tests, and 1 positive liver biopsy, in fact, is indicative of having liver cancer. Okay, so you've got the general protocol of the cascade of results that we're going to go through if, in fact, someone tests positive. Let's see how this works. Let's assume the population has a prevalence of liver cancer of 1 in 1,000 per year. Okay, so 0.1% of the population in any given year has liver cancer. Let's say that the blood test has a sensitivity of 0.5 and a specificity of 0.95. These are accurate numbers. Let's say the liver biopsy has a sensitivity of 0.95 and 0.98. Notice how much the sensitivity improves when we go from a blood test to a liver biopsy. That's why we do the liver biopsy, even though it's much more invasive, because the sensitivity improves significantly and the specificity a little bit, so that it's a very accurate test to do a liver biopsy. Here's what's going to happen. If we test everybody, the prevalence is that people with cancer are going to be 100 people in the population in our decision tree, and the people without cancer are going to be 99,900. This is just the background population prevalence. We don't know which of these 100,000 have cancer, the 100 who do. We don't know which of these 100,000 don't have cancer, the 99,900 who don't. But what we do know is that we want to screen for this to see if it will, in fact, tell us who is and who is not got cancer at any given time. So let's look at the population of people who have cancer. If we were to apply a blood test to them with a sensitivity of 50%, then half the time we would actually test and get a positive test result, and half the time we would get a negative test result. That is, half the time would be right and half the time would be wrong. So 50 out of the 100 are going to have a missed cancer. The blood test result will come back negative when in fact it should be positive because the person has cancer. Those are people we're going to send home and falsely reassure that they're fine, and they may even delay coming back into the clinic to get treated even after symptoms start to manifest, because they'll say, well, I screened for liver cancer and nothing came up. I surely don't have it. So I'm going to even delay treatment after symptoms begin. Of course, that's a problem. Let's take the population of people who test positive when they have cancer. They're going to come back in and get a repeat of their blood test. And of that, half the time we're going to miss and get a negative test result, and half the time we're going to get a positive test result. That's what we would predict with a sensitivity of 0.5 for the liver test. So once we have that, For the second group of population, we're going to miss an additional 25 cancers. These are, again, people we're going to send home, falsely reassuring them that they have no cancer, that the second test came back negative, and they can go about their lives without worrying. Of course, that's wrong. They have cancer, and we've just missed it in the second screening. Of the people who have the second test positive, we're going to do liver biopsies in this population. And so remember, now the sensitivity is 0.95 and the specificity is 0.98 for the liver biopsy test. That means we're going to miss one cancer because it's an accurate test. So one cancer will get missed even after a liver biopsy was done. Somebody is going to be sent home with a negative test result for the biopsy and assured that they don't have cancer when in fact they do. And 24 cancers will actually be detected after the positive 2 rounds of liver blood screening and 1 liver biopsy. We will in fact start to intervene and treat the cancer. So 24 out of 100 of the cancers will be correctly diagnosed. What about for the non-cancer population of 99,900 here over on the right side of our decision tree? In this population, we see that if we do a positive blood test, that with a sensitivity of 0.95, 4,995 of this population will be testing positive for cancer even though they don't have it. That's because there's an error rate of 0.05 when it comes to this sort of screening. And conversely, 94,905 of the population will screen negative for the no cancer, which is correct. They will be told they are well and they will go home, don't have to retest for cancer for another couple of years. So that population out of 99,900, quite correctly, 94,905 will be told they don't have cancer and they're sent home. Of the 4,995 who were false positives and told they had cancer when they don't, and that of course is very stressful to be told you have cancer and have a positive test result when in fact it's wrong, we're going to repeat the blood test immediately for them. On a second blood test, again with a 0.95 or 95% accuracy, 250 will test positive and 4,745 will test negative. So that means after 2 rounds of blood screening, 250 individuals are going to be told, yes, you've screened positive for cancer twice, even though they don't have it. In the negative population, we'll just send those people home too and tell them come back in a couple of years and test it. But for this positive testing population of false positives, they're going to get a liver biopsy, a procedure with its own risks. And in that invasive test population, 245 of the individuals will have an invasive test that will come back negative, but they will have had that invasive test unnecessarily. And so that test itself actually carries risk of fatality and also severe discomfort, morbidity. It's not simply a cost-free decision. So 245 people are going to have an unnecessary invasive test with potential risk of death from the test itself. And then 5% of the people who have that test are actually going to screen positive, even though they don't have cancer, after the biopsy. That is, they will be told after 2 rounds of blood testing and 1 round of liver biopsy that they definitively have cancer and will be treated for such even when they do not. Let me put this in tabulated form for us now, what these results show. Here's the results of the decision tree we just showed to test for the monitoring population. 24 people will be detected to have liver cancer correctly because they were screened. 76% of the 100 people who have liver cancer will actually be missed and will not be detected when they screen. 5,000 people, approximately 4,995 people, will be thought to have cancer who actually did not have cancer at some point in the screening process. Of those people, 247 will have minor complications related to a biopsy, unnecessarily. 28 of those people will have severe complications, including potential mortality, related to the biopsy who do not have cancer. And 99,891 people will be screened to have no disease or complications correctly. So that's what happens when we screen with a strategy of testing for people who don't show symptoms of liver cancer. What if we did the opposing thing? What if we just said we're not going to screen at all? Well, then we would miss 100 people without testing who have cancer, and we could have done something potentially for some of them. But of those people who don't have cancer, 99,900 of them will have no disease or complications. So we need to weigh out in the cost-benefit analysis in our minds, given these complicated results, which is the better thing to do overall, to screen or not to screen. Yes, we are going to pick up more people who have cancer if we screen, but we're also going to cause harm to people who don't have cancer, and we're going to miss some of the people who do. So is it worth going to the expense in creating the psychological harm and the potential secondary effects if we were to screen without being very cautious about why we're doing so? This shows us that even when the prevalence is sufficiently high that it might be worthwhile to screen, we need to step back, look at the results of screening, such as from a decision tree analysis as we just did, and compare that to the outcomes that would be in place and that we would predict statistically if we were not to do any monitoring or screening at all. In other words, there's always increasing cascades of harmfulness. Here's a little cute cartoon where somebody says it's a natural progression. We're going to put naked people through the X-ray detector or the bag screen device at the airport because it's the natural next step in making things more accurate, more safe, and so forth. It's not always the case. We have to remember there's always a false negative and a false positive rate, and we have to think about the harms and consequences that come from those false negatives and false positives before we decide screening is a good process. So we'll stop with that today, and in the next class we're going to move on to what we're going to call the cascade effect, talking about how do we tally up the potential harms that we're going to get into when in fact we decide to go forward with screening. I look forward to your thoughts about today's lecture, which introduced the concept of decision tree analysis to us. The idea that we can lay out in a tabular format the costs and benefits of any particular round of screening once we know the sensitivity, the specificity, and the prevalence for any given condition and test. I look forward to seeing you on the chat boards and in our next class.